The Lord be with you. My God, we thank you for another day where we get to walk through Deuteronomy. And as we finish Deuteronomy, may we not look back, but keep looking forward. Amen. I don't know how I have somehow turned on something right here. Okay. Welcome. So for the faithful few that have come to the review, you get your very own certificate. And we get I do not provide frames, although we do have a laminator, and you could laminate this. And
look at that!
No, it does not. But I changed the
questions unresolved. But I can't even read them.
Yeah, maybe I should wait till the end. So I changed the design to put the Deuteronomy overview map. And I did mostly okay with getting the background off of it. You'll see some spots I did not do that well. But this is your own, you finished Deuteronomy, and so you can take this with you.
Thank you.
It has been interesting to look at each class. I have tried to make one of these, and I think this is the design I might keep for them. So,
it's really.
And I even put our own little journey symbol on the side, that little back-looking thing. So, so this is yours. Good job. You have finished Deuteronomy. And I have extra, so if there's other people that you might see this week, grab an extra to give them that have been with us. And I'm sorry that this extra thing is on here. I clicked something and it says Canva Live, and I don't know how to make it go away. So just ignore that right there. For those who have not done a review part with us, we are not going to cover any new material. So if you remember back in college and your professor would do like that review before the test, that you cram everything in that you looked at this semester, that's kind of what today is. And on the one hand, it's a good day to catch up in case you missed anything that we looked at in the past or have any final questions, because my brain will get rid of Deuteronomy next week. It'll go away. So it's your last chance to ask questions. But I will say, this has become my favorite day each time that we have finished a book. Because the first week, we looked at the overview, we watched the Bible Project video, and we will end the class by watching it again. And it unlocks the book on this deeper level because we've walked through everything now. And so it really is one of my favorite times is when we get to kind of do this review. But ask any question that you want. So this is the last time we will see this little chart. There's got to be some way to make that go away. Oh, man, that is so weird. So we can say goodbye to this picture. And just where we are checking in, it is September 5th. We're doing our Deuteronomy wrap-up. We will not meet next week. My encouragement to you, if you want to have homework next week, is to read the Gospel of John. We will, on the 19th, do an introduction and an overview of it. So you have 3 whole weeks that you could read it. There's 21 chapters in John. You could read 7 chapters a week, which means you could read a chapter a day until we will actually begin to delve in. And so that's my homework part I will leave you with if you want. John is a really fun gospel. We'll be there soon. Where we are through all of our books, I just wanted to remember Exodus meant names, and it's called names because it begins with the genealogy and it ends with a genealogy. And so it goes, these are the names. Oh, sorry, no it doesn't. That's another book. See, this is why we got to do these reviews. I'm mixing my books up. So Exodus, what we want to remember is that they left Egypt. And so it's I'm Lord your God who brought you out of Egypt. Then we got to Leviticus. So Exodus was all about leaving Egypt. And then half the book is about how to build a tabernacle. And then Leviticus is all about how do they go inside that tabernacle. And so our summary statement is, be holy, for I am holy. You good? Okay. There's a little poppy back there, if you didn't see her. And then we get to the book of Numbers. So now we know how to get into the tabernacle. The question now is, how do we get the tabernacle to the promised land? And that's sort of what Numbers is about. It's about that journey. We summarized it with rebellion in the wilderness, because for 40 years, they just mess up everything back and forth, which is a lot like us. And so it's an annoying book, but then it's comforting because we're like that too. Deuteronomy is a summary of all of those three things. It goes back through the journey that they began in Exodus, back in Egypt. We go back through that journey through the wilderness. We go back over all of Leviticus and go over all of those laws again. And that's because Deuteronomy is the second law, which is the name. And if you'll remember, we have always said it's listen and love. So that's that Shema, hear or listen, O Israel. Love the Lord your God, or love Yahweh your God with everything that you have. And tell everyone about that. That's essentially how you would summarize Deuteronomy. One thing that we also talked about was that Deuteronomy is connected in a school of other books. So we call those the Deuteronomist books. And that includes Joshua, Judges, 1st and 2nd Samuel, 1st and 2nd Kings. We've not said this in here, but 1st and 2nd Samuel or 1st and 2nd Kings are one book. They're just on two scrolls because they're so big. And so it's the first scroll and the second scroll. And so Samuel and Kings, Jeremiah and Obadiah, they're all connected. You might be familiar with the prophet Jeremiah, and a lot of the content, even some of the very same words, are in Jeremiah. I forgot to say this last week, but the Song of Moses that we looked at last week, a lot of the very same words are repeated in Jeremiah from the Song of Moses. And so if you're reading through Jeremiah on a Sunday morning, you might go, oh, that sounds familiar. Well, it is, because we looked at it in Deuteronomy. And the other part that we talked about is Deuteronomy kind of rose in prominence. So there was this king named King Josiah, and essentially everyone had forgotten about how to worship God. And so King Josiah finds this scroll that was the book of the law, and he unrolls it, and he's like, oh my word, no wonder we're so messed up. We didn't do all this law. And so that book of the law is probably chapters 12 through 26 of Deuteronomy, and he kind of reinstitutes like the worship of Yahweh. And so they tear down all the altars, and they do all these things that it says to do in Deuteronomy. And what do you know? Like, God blesses them right after that. And so that's where Deuteronomy pops back up. And so if you read Book of the Law or Scroll of the Law, it's Deuteronomy. And so now you know. And now you can forget. So this was our summary.
You can count on that.
This is our more content-wise summary. This was not the one that we used, but I just wanted to show it back to you because when we look, like scholars look more at the content, they call the first speech of Moses the first 4 chapters, and then they call the second speech, this is only a few verses, but chapters 5 through 28. And then they say the last speech is 29 through 30. That's different than the outline that we have used. I just wanted to show that to you again. We looked at it the very first week. And if you really want to go through a scholarly breakdown, it's there in the slides. I'll send it out. But this is the one that we used, which has the first speech of Moses as chapters 1 through 11. And so that is different than the more kind of scholarly one. This one's based on the Bible Project chart. But this is our big movements that we walked through. So we looked at the story so far. This was kind of a review of what happened in Exodus and in Numbers. There was this call to covenant faithfulness. This is like the second half of Exodus when they were on Mount Sinai and it began to do the covenant. There was chapters 12 through 26, that second speech, all of the laws. That's like Leviticus. I mean, it essentially repeats what happens in Leviticus. And then the new part that happens in Deuteronomy is that third speech, chapters 27 through 34. And that includes the warnings and the ultimatum. So what happens when you don't follow the law? And heads up, it's not good. And it is what had already happened to them when they were in exile. And so it's when they come back into the land after they are going to rebuild the temple, after they've been in exile, it's saying stick to God so it doesn't happen again. And that's when it also goes through the blessings and the curses. which was my favorite week. And so if you were here that week, we reenacted this. It happens in Joshua chapter 8, but they cross over the Jordan River. So this gives the instructions, and then it actually plays out in Joshua. They cross over the Jordan River. Remember, that's right opposite of Jericho. And so they're up on the mountain, and then they cross over that river, and they build these tablets that have the law written on them. They set up their altar. I was just in the youth room a little bit earlier, and when we did this with the youth, I didn't even realize it. They stacked up all of their names on the railing in there with their stones, which was really cool. I didn't know that they had done that. And then we went up on the mountain and we did our little liturgy of the blessings and curses. If you want other copies of it, I have more that I can print out. But if there's anything you take away from Deuteronomy, you could just take that little covenant thing with you. And that gets us to when we're going to start to break down the chapters. So just as a heads up for what we're about to do, we're going to look at these overview ones. So this was every day. We gave a summary of each chapter. So there was like a word or a sentence to summarize it. And then we will highlight what to me was what stood out. If you have questions, please ask them if it rings any bells when you were looking at it. Those first 4 chapters go through all of the history of what Israel had been through so far. And so it begins with Abraham. So he was called, he was up here in Babylon, and he comes to the promised land for a little bit, but his grandson Jacob ends up in Egypt. And that's kind of where the history of Deuteronomy begins. It follows them on that journey from Egypt and back to the promised land. And this peninsula is the Sinai Peninsula. That's where they spent their 40 years wandering all about. And so that is what we talked about on the very first day when we broke this down. This is the map that is according to Deuteronomy. This is the map according to Exodus. So you might be more familiar with this one. Is my computer in the way? Here, I can move it. Mm-hmm. Yeah, let me move it right here.
Thank you.
Yeah. You look like you were going to get a strain in your neck or something. And so they went through all of these places. The only one that's really important is Sinai or Horeb. So that's where they're given the covenant. That's where they're given the Decalogue. And then this other place is Meribah, and that is where they have that big temptation part that happens. And so in the Psalms, if you're someone who uses like the Book of Common Prayer, you do Psalm 95, and it talks about Meribah and Massa. It covers that in this journey in Deuteronomy. And so we went in detail and looked at all of the events that happened. We are not going to do that today. But it's there if you want to go and find it. And so this is all of the places that they touched. And the only part I will say is that it was like they were hanging around for about 38 years until they got to Edom. And so that is where they kind of had some battles and such through here. And there was that big giant king, King Og of Bashan, that they fought. And he had a really big bed. If you remember our picture of him, he was like as tall as a building. And then they finally come to Nebo. And then they cross over the Jordan to Jericho, which is right on the other side. And that's where the book ends. And our lesson for what we looked at that day is following God in the wilderness. And so the wilderness journey symbolizes the Christian life. It's a journey of faith, challenges, and growth. The Israelites' mistakes serve as cautionary tales, reminding us to trust and obey God, even when the path seems long and difficult. Life is never easy, and we make mistakes all along the way. And so when we read all these mistakes, we don't have to look at them and be like, what's wrong with them? We can look at it and go, man, God still loves me too. And so that's our part. Follow God in the wilderness. Okay, chapters 4 through 11. Does anyone have other questions about that before I move? Great. The first part that we looked at in chapter 5 was the Decalogue, or the 10 Commandments. This might be the last time we say the word Decalogue for a while, and so that just means 10 words. Deca, 10, log, like logos, or it means word. And so we looked at the giving of the 10 Commandments, There are lots of ways that you can organize the Decalogue, but the way I like to start it is the way it does for the Jews. It begins with, I am the Lord your God who brought you out of Egypt. And so it doesn't actually start with a command. It begins with a relationship. And so that's why I always like to say the Decalogue, the words, because that first word is, we have a God who loves us and takes care of us. And then everything flows out of that. There's other ways that you can organize it too, and this is one I really like, this picture, because it's kind of good to teach kids. Number one, put God first. And yeah, there we go. Yeah, then we got to chapter 6, and we looked at the Shema. The Shema is the Hebrew word for hear or listen, and it just means pay attention, because this is important. And the Shema is this prayer, which is very familiar, hopefully, to you by now. There was this handout that I gave out, and I said put it by your bed so you can wake up and read it. But it's, Hear, O Israel, the Lord our God, the Lord is one. Love the Lord your God with all your heart, with all your soul, and all your strength. These commandments that I give to you today are to be on your hearts. Impress them on your children. Talk about them when you sit at home and when you walk along the road, when you lie down and when you get up. Tie them as symbols on your hands and bind them on your foreheads. Write them on the doorframes of your houses and on your gates. And then we played this little kid song that I am going to play for just 1 minute. That is the Hear, O Israel.
Hear, O Israel, the Lord our God, the Lord is one. Hear, O Israel, the Lord our God, the Lord is one. These commandments that I give to you.
So I hope that song was familiar to you, and I hope it gets stuck in your head. I will send this back out, and we'll have another link to this song, just in case you want to keep it. That's the Shema. It is a prayer, and it's all about, remember those things God has done for you, dwell on them, and talk about them with everyone else. Put physical reminders of them around you. And so, one way you can do that is you can wear like a bracelet with a cross or a necklace with a cross. That's one thing I like to do, because this necklace or bracelet, it's annoyingly red, which the color red is bright, and it gets my attention all the time. And so anytime I move my arm, I always see it, and my hope is it helps me dwell on God. So that's what the Shema is about. Just find the ways to continue to dwell on all these things God has done. Keep it in your minds. And what we looked at as a lesson for that chapter is the God of abundance and needs. So Deuteronomy 6 gives a warning to Israel to not forget God when they enter the land of abundance or the easy life. As 21st century Westerners, we live in a land of abundance, and we have a really easy life. The same warning carries to us to follow and to seek God during our own times of abundance and not just need. We all have this tendency, but we see it a lot with Israel. They would have a hard time, turn to God. God would bless them, forget about God. And then they would have a hard time and then go to God. And so that's that reminder. When they go into land, don't forget God. We also talked about, let me go back to my little summary part. Because there's the renewal of the covenant and then a beginning look at the blessings and the curses. It didn't go over it. It just gave like, hey, this is coming up. But we talked about how there is like a new law for a new generation, and they had these new tablets. Hey, baby. I love you too. And so our lesson for that in Deuteronomy 10 is, what does God require of you? This might sound familiar. Micah 5:2 is the verse more people are familiar with, but it begins in Deuteronomy. And so now, O Israel, what does the Lord your God, what does Yahweh your God require of you? Only to fear the Lord your God, to walk in all his ways, to love him, to serve the Lord your God with all your heart, all your soul, and to keep the commandments of the Lord your God and his decrees that I am commanding you today, for your own well-being. Circumcise them on the foreskins of your heart, and do not be stubborn any longer. He is your praise. He is your God, who has done for you these great and awesome things that your own eyes have seen. Again, remember these things of God. Dwell on them. Let them saturate inside of you. and remember. Okay, that's that part. That finishes that first speech of Moses. So it's all about where they had been and letting kind of God dwell inside of you. And so it's not just rituals and things that we do. It is a change in our own being, of being geared towards God. That moves then to the second speech of Moses. We flew through this in like 2 weeks. We didn't really fly through it. We crammed it. And so we said this before, but it roughly corresponds to the Decalogue and kind of the order of those laws. The first set of those laws go over Israel's worship. And we talked about this then, but the way that you worship is intrinsically connected to how you treat other people. And so this section about worship contains a lot of material on how you treat the vulnerable in society, or even something as simple and practical about putting that fence around your roof so people don't fall off. How you treat other people, how you think about other people, it's connected to how you worship God. And so they go together. And the other really big thing that Deuteronomy is focused on is that there is one God, and that you worship that one God in the one temple. And that makes sense because Deuteronomy is about like coming back to the land, and they're building a temple. And so, yeah, you want to emphasize the temple and not all these other places. The second part of this section has to do with Israel's leaders, and I'm not going to go back through this part. And so I just put on the side in case anyone really wanted to read about how that stuff is set up, because you're weird. Chapter 17 talks about kings. Chapter 18 talks about the priesthood and prophecy. So the religious inheritance from Moses is going to be priests and prophets. And so it's decentralized, it's spread out. And then the more like political role is divided later to a king, as well as the judicial and executive branch. And it goes through all of that. If you're really curious, you are welcome to go and read that again. We are not in here. Okay, chapters 12 through 18, the other parts, though, begin by dealing with the centralization and the purification of worship. And this is the part I love. We called it the meat revolution. And so this is a really big deal and a big change. So they used to have all of these altars everywhere, which makes sense because there's no temple. And the temple, when they had it, was far away. And so they had all of these altars everywhere. In Deuteronomy 12, we see the shift to having a single sanctuary. There's a single place where everything happens. What that means, though, is how would you still eat meat? Because before this, any time that an animal was killed, it was considered a sacrifice to God. And so you had altars everywhere. Every house would have an altar, or every village, because you would always, any meat, anything, was a sacrifice. And so the meat revolution changes it. The only sacrifices that can take place is going to be at the temple, or at that place the Lord appoints. And then there's now secular slaughter. And so you could kill and eat animals, but it didn't have to be a sacrifice anymore. To kind of take that place of not having everything be a sacrifice, like every Friday when you would slaughter a goat or whatever, they changed it to have some pilgrimage feast, which we'll get to in a moment. Our lesson for that is God of the changing times. So the law to only sacrifice to God at one place restricted people's ability to eat meat around the whole land. This centralization of worship could have been burdensome to the people who didn't live near the place Yahweh had chosen. Instead of being a burden, God changed the rules so that the people could still eat meat. And my encouragement to you is, what ways do you see God's expanding inclusion that also uphold the sanctity of God's worship? And those things don't have to contradict. A lot of the times we put like how I worship God, and it ends up being uninclusive, or it excludes people. I forget who had said this, and it is some New Testament theologian, and I'm forgetting the name. But it's whenever we read in the Gospels or in the Bible, like we're never shocked, because what is shocking about it is not how God is exclusive, it's how inclusive God is. And that's very true of the gospel. It almost like shocks us how inclusive that everyone can be pulled in. And we see that way back here in Deuteronomy. It's expansive and who can connect to God. Okay, cool. All right. Chapter 14, we talked about some different dietary laws and tithing, and those things kind of are connected. So instead of always making a sacrifice, they would, once a year, they would give 10%. They would keep 10% and give it to the temple. And that would usually happen when they would go to the temple. But if they couldn't afford that, they could sell that 10% and use the money to travel and then buy things back in the land. And then every third year, they would give it to the poor, to everyone else. And the other part that this one covered is about clean and unclean animals. And I thought it might come up again. And it's really, like, we think about what's kosher or clean and unclean as being really complicated, but it really isn't. So, like, there's 3 types of, like, areas. There's the land, there's the air, and there's the sea. And if it's clean, it neatly fits into that category. If it's unclean, it blurs the lines. For example, if something lives in the air, what does it have? Wings. There we go. If it lives in the sea, what does it have? Fins. Okay, so is fish clean or unclean? Clean. What about crabs? They're unclean because they have legs. And what has legs? Land animals. Yeah. So it's not too complicated, though there is a nice chart that it goes through. And this one's from Leviticus, but essentially it's if it blurs the lines, then it's not right. And so, like, for animals or for birds, it's clean if it has wings and it eats bird food. If it eats meat, then it's unclean. If it doesn't talk about insects, but that is dealt with in Leviticus. For land animals, so they have hooves and they eat grass. If they don't have hooves or they don't eat grass, then it's unclean. And that kind of paradigm for sanitary reasons makes a lot of sense. Like, you want to eat a raw pork chop, but you might eat like a rare steak. Like, we kind of have some of those same connotations today. And then same thing for the water. So if it has fins, it's good. If it doesn't have fins, then we don't do it. And just on that note, so like shrimp and crab and then like insects, they are the same family. We're just the opposite of them. We don't eat bugs. But we think of like lobster as a delicacy. Like, it's just backwards for them. And that's just common for that part of the world. So it's not like the clean and unclean things aren't too weird. Any questions on that though? Great. Okay. Oh, wow. So the next part is we talked about the sabbatical year, or the year of generosity. And that is the year of Jubilee, which means the year of release. And we're going to, let me check the time. Yes, we're going to play a 3-minute video on Sabbath that I didn't have time to play when we were covering it. And so I'm excited to play it. But our lesson that we learned about that year of release, that Jubilee year, is from Deuteronomy 15. The year of release teaches us about the importance of forgiveness, especially in financial matters. We should strive to forgive debts and be generous to those in need, recognizing that everything we have is a gift from God, and everyone needs rest, and that's true for ourselves. And so next week, take a break, have a rest, don't be here. And then, if John is too overwhelming, don't be here for that too. But be here if it's good for you. And that's true for all of our things in life. Find what's good for you, find what's life-giving, do those things. If it's not life-giving, maybe take a break for a little bit. That's what Sabbath is all about. And Sabbath has lots of other meanings, and we're going to play this video to talk about that, but only 3 minutes of it.
The number 7 is a big deal in the Bible.
Yeah, in biblical Hebrew, the word 7 is connected to the idea of fullness or completeness.
And that's something we all long for, but don't often experience. Instead, we find ourselves working endlessly, fighting back chaos with no real rest.
Yes. Now keep all that in mind as we turn to Genesis 1 in the Bible. It begins with darkness and disorder, but then God speaks to bring about light and order so that life can flourish.
And this happens over the course of 6 days.
Each day is marked with the phrase, there was evening and there was morning. But on the 7th day, something special happens.
God stops and rests.
Right. Creation is brought to its completion on the seventh day. And that phrase, there was evening and there was morning, it doesn't appear on day 7.
It's like a day with no end.
On the seventh day, God's presence fills his creation. The land provides for all of God's creatures, including humans, who are appointed to rule the world with God forever.
Kings and queens of the seventh day rest. I can get into that.
But the humans are deceived by a dark power, and they forfeit that rest. They're exiled into the wilderness, where they have to work as slaves to the land.
Until they die and return to the dust from which they came.
But God wants to restore humanity back to that seventh-day rest. So he chooses to give the family of Israel that experience of ultimate rest so they can share it with others.
But how? They're in Egypt, slaves to an oppressive empire who's grinding them into the dust.
So God confronts Egypt and he liberates the Israelites, taking them through the darkness and chaos on the way to the promised land.
Now, while they're on their way, they find themselves in the wilderness. It's easy to get lost. Life is a struggle. They're not in the land of rest yet.
But while they're on the way, God invites them in the wilderness to start living as if they're in the promised land.
But how do you practice the future rest in the wilderness?
Well, God tells them that every seventh day they are to stop their work, or in Hebrew, to Shabbat, so that they can rest and enjoy God's good world.
So take a whole day to live as if the ultimate rest has already come.
Yeah, this is the Sabbath, celebrated every week on the seventh day. But there's more. The Sabbath is just one of 7 festivals that Israel practiced every year, each one anticipating that seventh-day rest.
That is a lot of 7s.
And there's even more. Every 7 years, the Israelites were to liberate slaves, forgive debts, and let the land rest for a whole year. And then, every 7 times 7 years was the ultimate seventh-day rest, called the year of Jubilee. If anyone had lost their land or gone into debt, all was forgiven, everything restored.
Also the Sabbath, these feasts, the year of Jubilee, it's all pointing towards the hope of future rest.
Right. Now, when the Israelites went into the land, they forgot their God, and so they forfeited their chance to rest in the promised land.
They're exiled and enslaved again by an oppressive nation, led back into a world of chaos and disorder.
But Israel's prophets said would come.
And then Jesus. Okay, so that was about to get to the Jesus part. Sabbath is a big deal. And it's not something that we talk about a lot, but throughout the biblical narrative, particularly in the Old Testament, it is one of the central ideas. And so every 7 days you have a Sabbath, every 7 years you have a Sabbath year, and every 7 of the 7 years you have the Jubilee year, which resets everything back. And so keep that theme of Sabbath in your life and the idea of rest. And the way I think about rest, it's just whatever is life-giving. And so for some people, working out in the garden might be life-giving. I remember when I was younger and like it would be, I don't know, it was like a Sunday or something. And if I had it mowed on Saturday, I would try to mow on a Sunday, which I like to mow. When I was younger, it was fun. I could sing with the mower and no one could hear that I didn't sound well. And so... but my parents would never let me mow because we had to have Sabbath. And so Sabbath can be anything. It could be at the tennis court. It could be at the soccer field. It could be whatever gives life to you. And so, remember that. The other part that connects with this and the centralization of worship is the annual festivals that they would take. And this was yet another video that we did not get to play. And so we're going to play this. This goes through the 3 pilgrimage feasts. And then this YouTube channel, it's like a dialogue between Muslims and Jews. And so it is geared toward like an Islamic audience. So if they use words you don't know, it is a very similar Islamic feast, just for the context of that. Ooh, I messed something up.
Elchanan, are you home?
Hey Suha, I'm out here, sitting in my sukkah. Grab a seat.
So why are we sitting in this hut?
Sukkot marks the 40-year journey of the people of Israel through the Sinai Desert. That's where they lived.
It's a bit hot out here. Won't it be more comfortable in the AC?
Sitting outside is the whole idea. We leave our cozy homes and all the stuff we've accumulated and move into a temporary home for an entire week.
So that's it? You just sit around in a hut for a week?
Not at all. We're also commanded to collect 4 types of plants: a citron, a palm frond, 3 myrtle branches, and 2 willow branches, and shake them while we pray.
Shape them?
Yep. North, south, east, and west, up and down. It's complicated though.
Sounds about as logical as juggling 3 hamsters.
Anyway, in the Torah, Sukkot is one of 3 pilgrimage festivals in which Jews from all across the land would gather at the temple in Jerusalem to celebrate and bring their sacrifices. After the 2 temples were destroyed, all our rituals, minus the sacrifices, moved into the synagogue.
So what exactly do you do during the other 2 pilgrimage festivals?
Let's start with the famous one, Passover. Like Sukkot, Passover commemorates the Exodus from Egypt, the liberation of the Israelites from slavery under the evil Pharaoh.
You know that in the Quran, Pharaoh is also the bad guy and the Israelites are the good guys. So to commemorate that, you eat those dry crackers, right?
You mean matzah? The people of Israel were in a great rush to leave Egypt and couldn't wait for their bread to leaven. That's why we eat this bread of the poor, made only of flour and water, and baked for no more than 18 minutes. We get a bit obsessive cleaning our homes to remove all remnants of bread before the 7-day holiday.
Obsessive seems to be a recurring theme here.
But it's worth it, because then we gather as a family for an elaborate feast called Seder, where we relive the story of our Exodus.
Do you shake things here too?
No, but we do showcase certain foods, symbolizing central aspects of Egypt. Bitter herbs representing the suffering of slavery. Charoset, a sweet paste, made of dates and apples resembling the mortar used by the slaves for construction, and a shank bone, representing God's mighty hand in liberating us. 50 days after Passover, we come to the 3rd pilgrimage festival, Shavuot. We believe this is when Moses received the Torah from God on Mount Sinai.
That reminds me of Laylatul Qadr, the holy night in which the first verses of the Quran were revealed to Nabi Muhammad.
On Shavuot, it's customary to stay up all night studying Torah and other Jewish texts. We also traditionally eat dairy meals and lots of cheesecake.
I can live with that. Tell me more.
So that is the 3 different feasts. I hope those sounded familiar. So it's the Festival of the Booths, or Tabernacles, is the first one they went over, and then it ended with the Passover feast. And you might remember when we did a little, we brought some Passover food in and had a feast, but we weren't down here. I think we were still upstairs at that point. And so that is the 3 pilgrimage feasts that they would go on. Then that moved us to the second set of laws that they would kind of cover. And so the first part we looked at in chapter 19 is the cities of refuge. And so you might remember there are 6 different cities throughout the land. They're spread out so that everything is within like a day's walk. You could get there. And if you were accused of murder, like if you had actually killed someone, or even if like your wagon ran away and ran over someone, to stop blood vengeance or someone getting back, you could go to one of these cities and there await trial, and you were safe there. If you were convicted, then you would be killed because you had murdered someone. And then if you were not, you could stay and be safe in that city, which would stop you from being attacked by the Redeemer in the family. And so it was a way of stopping kind of blood vengeance and family feuds. And then every time there's a new high priest, everyone was set free and they could go back to their lands or on the year of Jubilee. And so that was fun. You could go to a trial in a court. And that is the part we talked about that's beginning the kind of judicial system. We see some of that reflected here. I really like that chapter and that concept. There was a lot of other things that we talked about. If you'll remember, we talked about like laws of warfare. I thought about pulling this up, but the save the trees. And so there is a limitation on how they could fight, and that included with how they would receive prisoners of war. And they couldn't do they couldn't burn down all of the forest and all the fields. They couldn't have a scorched earth policy. And so there was a respect sort of in the laws of having war. There was other family laws and things like that. Lots of different laws about who could be in the assembly or in the temple. But the part I really love was in chapter 24. And so this covered some different laws of divorce, justice, and compassion. And that included the law of gleaning. And this went over lots of different things. the compassion laws have to do with how the most vulnerable in society are kind of dealt with. So that includes a woman who has been divorced, and so she couldn't be tossed back and forth between different men. She would have her own choice, kind of in a limited sense in that society. There was a lot of protections for those in the military, and no one had to be drafted. And so newlyweds or anyone, like even if you were uncomfortable, you didn't have to go to war. Yeah. All right, go finish your food. Okay, I'll give you something.
Should she get a certificate?
Oh, she might. It'll be a little colorful by the end, though. There was different laws on wages, on how some justice was kept within the family. And then the part I really loved is the gleaning laws. And so you probably remember when we talked about this, the edges of the field had to be left. And if they were harvesting food and they dropped it, they were not to go back and get it. And so there's Ruth, because this happens with Ruth. And so I talked about when I was in college, we had to do a paper or something that was about this, and it was a life-changing experience. But we had played this video of a guy that owned a lumber mill, and he was like, the way I follow this is I leave the sawdust at the end of the night, and people can come and collect sawdust. And some people do collect sawdust, and they use it for different things. But I was like, man, that really just misses the point of what this could be. Yeah.
In my notes on chapter 24, I've got laws of gleaming. Would you elaborate on what that
It's a gleaning with an N. And so, gleaning with an N. And so that was how they would harvest the foods. But sometimes they did it with a funny face. And so, the gleaning laws or the harvest laws. And so, I always thought that missed so much of the point. Because the ones that owned the fields could work. And if you didn't own a field, then you were kind of left out. And so this was all about those who didn't have easy access to work to be able to work for themselves. And so we talked about that in here, but in the law of gleaning, we see those who own fields and thus have easy access to working purposely leave the edges and the leftovers for others to get access and work for themselves. Modern day ways of accessing work include education, transportation, capital, childcare, healthcare, etc. And then we asked, what are ways that we think we can support this law of gleaning in our own lives and in the communities around us? And there are, different political things that you can do for that, but other ways that we as individuals and as a church community can get involved is all these things that we already do, like Justice Knox, which this year is tackling transportation, or Fish, which helps people that don't have food. If you're worried about not eating, you can't go get a better job. Because you're just trying to get day by day. Places like VMC that help you when, if you've kind of lost everything and need to start over. Family Promise, which helps people with housing. And then we put a mirror up because there's also you, and you can make a difference in the communities around you. I would say from like the life-changing moments of Deuteronomy, this part, the law of gleaning, for me is one of those biggest life-changing. And this was a story, or one of the top 5 stories that made me fall in love with the Old Testament. Because I'm like, wow, this is pretty radical and progressive, particularly for its time, but even for us. And so, yeah, that's that part. And then we moved on to chapters 27 through 30. And this is all about the blessings and the curses, the blessings and the curses and the covenant. And just as a reminder, there's 2 mountains, there's 2 paths of life, one that leads to not good stuff, one that leads to good stuff. And we reenacted that when we did our own blessings and curses with our liturgy. And I think we've talked enough about that, and that was only 2 weeks ago. And so we don't need to say anything else. Then last week, we finished the book, and this was kind of the farewell address from Moses. And it covers Moses' kind of dying wishes, the Song of Moses, and his blessing on the tribes, and then when he dies. And so our lesson for that, the first chapter, was preparing for death. Moses wraps up everything before he dies. And that's just good life advice. And so that's a lesson we can take. But the part we really want to remember is the 2 songs of Moses. And so I had played one song of Moses, and it's from Exodus. But then there's another song of Moses from Deuteronomy 32. And I'm just going to play 1 minute of it again. It's the first couple of verses, or the first 4.
Listen, O heavens, and I will speak. Hear, O earth, the words that I say. Let my teaching fall on you like rain. Let my speech settle like dew. Let my words fall like rain on tender grass, like gentle showers on your lands. I will proclaim the name of the Lord. How glorious is our God. How glorious is our God. He is the rock. His deeds are perfect. Everything he does is just and fair. He is a faithful God. He is a faithful God.
And that is a very modern way that you could sing the Song of Moses, but I think it really does help transform when we read these old texts like this, to hear it as a song. It really does help bring it to life. The other thing that we did last week is we compared, that's a loud word, is how Deuteronomy 32 is set up like a divine lawsuit. And so I just wanted to give that as a brief reminder. It begins with this calling of witnesses of heaven and earth, as we heard in the song. It goes through this accusation, like, look at all these great things God did for you. And then it goes through all of those actions that God has done. And then there's the indictment, which is that, like we saw in Numbers, Israel just didn't care, and they rebelled against God. And so then there's this declaration of punishment that is about to happen, and it's the curses, like we looked at the week before. But God stops, and actually stops the punishment and reverses it. And so he ends up blessing Israel instead, and that punishment goes out to the other nations who never turned back to God. And then it kind of concludes, and everyone praises God in the end. And so it's set up like this lawsuit. It's laid out in an interesting way, but you can also sing it in a nice way. And that's why we played that video. After that, Moses gives a blessing to most of the tribes. And they are just like you would expect any blessing. It's just good wishes to everyone. The only one it leaves out is Simon or Simeon, and they have just been absorbed into Judah by this point, so they don't really exist. And then Moses dies, and that's the end of Deuteronomy. And so that's sort of how the book finishes. And in just a second, we're going to watch the Bible Project video. But if anyone has any last questions, this is your chance. Anything you want to ask, even if it's loosely related to Deuteronomy?
I have something that's very loosely
okay.
related to the gleanings.
Oh, to the gleanings, yes.
And interpreting that to apply also to God's creation. And I'm thinking particularly now when you read about restoring habitat, leaving, for example, the road edges along fields, not going to the edge, not going to the road, but leaving a space for wildflowers, wildlife, weeds, whatever. So applying that to creation, to other life forms, not just human beings.
Yeah, well, that's one thing throughout Deuteronomy and Leviticus as well, is it's about this connection with creation. And so shalom, like that peace. What I love about that is it's more than just like calm or not fighting. It's this interconnectedness or holisticness. And it kind of begins internally, but then it spreads in the community and with the land. And then from there kind of spreads to the whole world. And so that idea of like shalom is like to live in peace and communion with everything, which is why every 7 years they let the land rest, because it deserves a rest just like we do. I like that. Thanks for bringing that up. I think I saw someone's hand move.
Well, I have one other question.
Okay.
every however many years, when all debt is forgiven.
Yeah, the 50th year.
I'm curious, in real time, is that actually what happened?
No, not really. But it was a goal to aspire to. Potentially, and it didn't really happen. But like also with that, like, there was just political realities with Israel. They mostly weren't in control of themselves, but it was still a goal to aspire to.
Oh, thank you.
Yeah.
I was just reading the last few verses of 32, and it's talking about Moses and then Aaron too, when they went up on the mount.
Yes.
And it says, "For both of you broke faith with me among the Israelites." So he was showing them for a distance they will view the land, but you will not go there. So why could they not be forgiven?
Great question. One of the most easy reason is just a practical lesson of consequences. Did y'all get these?
This was Brenda.
Yes, Brenda's. Okay, here you go.
Thank you.
So, the most obvious part is just it's a consequence of their actions, and that was important to enforce.
Yeah.
The other thing is everyone has a time to do a certain work. God gives us all a thing to do. And Moses' job was to get them out of Egypt and to keep them alive. And he did that. And Joshua's job was to help them get established in the land. He did that. And so, I think on one side is just they had different jobs. And that's true for us too. God might call us to one work, but not everything. And so, they each had their own work to do. And God was with them for that work. And then it was someone else's time to get to serve as well. And when I think about it like that, it makes me a little bit more hopeful. Man, I don't have to do everything. But primarily it's just he lost the chance to. Okay. Y'all are asking hard questions. Cool. Okay, this is our Bible project overview. And it's a lot of fun when you watch it the second time. Oh my word, I'm having trouble with this. There we go.
The book of Deuteronomy is the fifth book of the Bible and the final book of the Torah. After the exodus from Egypt, Israel was at Mount Sinai for 1 year, entering into a covenant with their God. And then they had the disastrous road trip through the wilderness, and the Exodus generation disqualified themselves from entering into the land promised to Abraham. And so Deuteronomy begins with Moses standing in front of this new generation, explaining the Torah. And it's from here that the design and purpose of the book unfolds. Deuteronomy is a series of speeches from Moses where he's calling the next generation of Israel to be faithful to the covenant with their God. At the center of the book is a collection of laws, which are the terms of the covenant between God and Israel. Some of the laws are new, but many are repeated from the laws given earlier at Mount Sinai. And that's actually where this book gets its name, from a Greek word, Deuteronomion, which means a second law. Now, surrounding these laws are two outer sections of Moses' speech. Each of these are broken up into two parts themselves. Let's just dive in and we'll see how this whole thing works. So Moses, first of all, summarizes the story so far, and he highlights how rebellious the previous generation was, in contrast with God's constant grace and provision in the wilderness. And God did bring his justice on them, yes, but he did not abandon his covenant promises. After this comes a series of very passionate sermons where Moses calls on this new generation to be more faithful than their parents were to the covenant. He reminds them of the Ten Commandments, and then the centerpiece of this section is a famous line called the Shema. Moses says, "Listen, Israel, the Lord is our God, the Lord alone, and you shall love the Lord your God with all of your heart, with all of your soul, and with all of your might." This became a very important daily prayer in Judaism, and it brings all of the themes of the book together. So the word listen, or Shema in Hebrew, it means much more than just to hear. Its meaning includes responding to what you hear, or in English we would say, obey. And the word love in Hebrew also means much more than just an emotion or feeling. It's about a decision of wholehearted devotion to God that involves your will and your emotions, your mind and your heart. Now, for Israel, their obedience and devotion to God served a much larger purpose. Obedience to the laws is going to make Israel a unique people among the nations. Just like God said at Mount Sinai, they'll become a kingdom of priests. And Moses now says, how? Israel has the chance, by following the laws, to show the whole world the wisdom and the justice of God. The other key idea in the Shema is that Israel was called to obey and be devoted to the Lord alone. Or literally, in Hebrew, it says, the Lord is one. Now, in context, the point is that the Lord is the one God Israel is to worship and obey. Israel's about to go into the land of Canaan, where people worship idol gods that represent all different aspects of creation: the sun, the weather, sex, and war. And in Moses' view, worshiping these gods degrades humans and destroys communities. But worshiping the God of Israel, who's the creator and the redeemer, that will lead to life and blessing. And so we come to the large collection of laws at the center of the book. And they're roughly arranged by topic. So the opening section is about Israel's worship of their God. They were to have one central temple where one God would be worshipped. And also, God was to be worshipped in Israel's care for its poor. So for example, all Israelites were to set aside 1/10 of their annual income to be given to the temple. But another 10th was to be set aside every 3 years and given to the poor. And these are the kinds of laws that put Israel on the cutting edge of justice in comparison to their ancient neighbors. And it was all bound up with their worship of God. The next section outlines the character qualities of Israel's leaders. So the elders, the priests, the kings, these were all placed under the authority of the covenant laws, which God said that he would enforce by sending prophets to keep the leaders accountable. So in contrast to Israel's neighbors, where kings were thought of as divine and a law unto themselves, Israel's leaders were subordinate to the law and the prophets. Following this is a large section of laws about Israel's civil life, so rules about marriage and family and business, and also about social justice, about their legal system and how it was to protect widows and orphans and immigrants. And then these are concluded by more laws about worship. Now, here's some tips for reading all of these laws. Remember, first of all, these are the terms of the Sinai covenant given specifically to ancient Israel, living in a culture that's very different from yours. And so, two, it's not going to be helpful to compare these laws with modern laws from a very different culture. Rather, these were given to set Israel apart. And so we need to compare these laws with those of Israel's neighbors, like in Assyria or Babylon. And when you do that, all of a sudden laws that seemed harsh or bizarre become much more clear. You see that God is pushing Israel to a higher level of justice than was ever known before. And so finally, try to discern what core principles of wisdom or justice underlie any particular law. And you'll discover some really profound things. So here's an extra credit assignment. Go and see how Paul the Apostle does this very thing in his first letter to the Corinthians, chapter 9, verse 9. And he quotes a law from Deuteronomy, chapter 25, verse 4. It's really interesting. So back to Moses. After he goes through all of the laws, he issues a final challenge that Israel should listen to and love their God. He first issues a warning and an ultimatum. If Israel listens to and obeys their God, everything's going to go great, lots of divine blessing. But if they don't listen and rebel, famine, plague, devastation, and ultimately exile from the land. And then Moses forces a decision. He says, "Today I set before you all life or death, blessing or curse, goodness or evil. So choose life by loving the Lord your God and listening to him." But then Moses says this. He says, "I know that after I die, you're going to rebel and turn away from God and end up in exile." Which is kind of a downer. But then again, he's been with these people for decades, and it becomes clear that his hopes are not very high. But all is not lost, Moses says. One day, when Israel is sitting in exile, at any point, Moses says they can turn back to their God, who will, in his words, circumcise your hearts so that you may love him with all your heart and soul and live. Now, this is a vivid metaphor that's saying something is fundamentally wrong with Israel's heart. It's stubborn and hard. And it's the same thing wrong with the heart of all of humanity. This is going all the way back to the rebellion in the garden. Humans seized autonomy from God. They wanted to define good and evil for themselves, and they ruined God's good world as a result. But one day, Moses says, God is going to do something to transform the hearts of his people so that they can truly listen to and love God from the heart and be led back to true life. And this is the promise that gets picked up by the later biblical prophets, Jeremiah and Ezekiel, the hope for a new heart. So Moses ends his speech with a poem of warning and then a blessing, and then he walks up onto a mountain and he dies. And so the Torah draws to a close. All of the major plot tensions of the biblical story are in place, but left totally unresolved. So when is the descendant of the woman going to come and defeat evil? Or how is God going to rescue the whole world and bless all nations through this family? And how can God's holiness be reconciled with people who are continually rebellious? And how is God going to transform the hearts of his people? You just have to keep reading to find out. But for now, that's what the book of Deuteronomy is all about.
And we will not find out about what comes after that because we will be in John. And I'm not good at clicking this, apparently. Okay. Next week, we will be not meeting. And so my encouragement to you is, as I said before, to read the book of John, the Gospel of John. And I just wanted to give that brief reminder. So gospel means good news. And it's like a biography about Jesus, but it's different than biographies that we write today. What's special about John is it's the good news for everyone. And so the other Gospels are maybe more geared toward Jews or to Greeks or to Romans, but this one is not. It's for anyone to read. And Jesus is presented as the eternal Word of God, and there's a bunch of miracles as proof. And then what really stands out to me in the Gospel of John is these 7 I am statements. If you do go and read it, just a few quick notes about John. So there are lots of 7s that happen, and there are lots of signs or miracles. Roughly, you could divide the Gospel of John into 2 parts. We call it the book of signs and the book of glory. And so the book of signs goes over just all of these miracles Jesus does. There are 7 big ones, and they kind of correspond to the 7 I am statements. The book of glory is like the passion of Jesus and the resurrection of Jesus. And then, I had one more part I was going to say about John. Book of signs, book of glory, 7. That might be it. But it begins very different than the other ones. So in the beginning was the Word, or the Logos of God, and the Logos was with God, and the Logos was God. He was in the beginning, he was with God in the beginning. That word Logos, if you want to just have fun, just look up what it means, and your next few weeks will be consumed. And so it is a very philosophical term. We will talk about that first week. But essentially it's like what thought is, and like how thought comes into being. It's a very deep Greek word, and you will have fun when you read John. You don't really need to know that. That's John. This is Journey Through the Bible. The Lord be with you.
Also with you.
My God, we thank you that we finished Deuteronomy. We pray that we would have a rest and a Sabbath next week. But as we go through the Gospel of John, you will go with us as we meet you more deeply. Amen.
And Alexander, may I say one thing? There are some of us during that hour next week. We're taking advantage of the fact there is a class.
Oh, yeah.
And we're inviting the seniors at a center, just saying, come on by, have a cup of coffee, and hang out. We're going to be in this pretty garden area, and it's nothing planned. We might have a snack, but we know we'll have coffee or water or lemonade, and just that we're going to be here. So all are welcome. It's just an activity, because the next thing we do as a senior minister, we're going to go on a couple of field trips. We're going to Townsend and we're going to Oak Ridge in October and November. We thought, gosh, we've had our art show, but we want to do something before we go hit the road.
Yeah.
And so since that hour is cleared, so everybody can come on. And
is it at 11:45?
It's at
10 to 11:30.
10 to 11:30.
Yeah, 10 to 11:30.
Okay.
Yeah. So it's after breakfast and before lunch. So managing your expectations.
I'll take the nighttime people too. That sounds like fun.
For sure. We got to, we just hang out so often. We chat at the door in the parking lot after, we go, gee, we got to hurry to class or after. So it's just time to just hang out. I mean, just visit and yeah.
Good use.
It's just going to rain. We'll make the coffee.
Oh, I know.
I know. We might bring a box of it. Yeah. A box of coffee.
What is she saying? I can't hear.
Yeah, no, just a heads up. Joy and I are going to be bringing some books that are in the library about John on our next
Oh,
meeting.
that'd be fun.
Oh, great. So you can see what we've got and check them out if you're interested.
Good idea.
We
I think that's a
John,
Sabbath
at the beginning.
use of.
Yeah,
Yeah.
that's so here a little early. Eat, drink, and be merry, and look at books. It's
Relax,
just kind
do
of
what
hang
you
out.
love.
It's a official hangout. So that's.
What would be good food? We could all bring food when we start, John.
Whoa, baby.
Yeah.
Like cookies, maybe? I don't know.
We tend to like to eat.
I mean, you can never go wrong with food.
More deviled eggs.
Yes, on the 19th, right?
Well, we're getting
No,
into
this
fall
is the
foods.
26th.
Yeah.
On the
Pumpkin
19th.
bread.
Yeah, the 19th is when we'll start it.
I know.
It looks like it's 11:30 and it's in
Scholars
there.
of Deuteronomy now.
Let's put it, I think it's going to look
Well, I realized I was